I'm Ethan, 21. This isn't a crime story, it's a rescue. The target, a silver bike with a stubborn chain. The window, 3 days. The complication, the person who signed it away shares my last name. I didn't need a getaway car, just enough cash to outrun a rule we lived by. Everything we loved went to the pawn shop until Friday. Most things came back. This one had to. The shop sat between the bus depot and a bakery that glazed cakes in the front window. If you stood in the crosswind, you got our whole neighborhood in one breath, sugar and collateral. The bell on the pawn door was blunt as a knuckle. Inside, glass cases turned random life into displays. Watches with strangers' hours still inside them, drills that had eaten through 2 summers of siding, a violin whose strings looked like apology. People walked in with the trying hard faces of those who planned to be brief. No one planned to become a regular. I was 12, planning wasn't our luxury. The shop knew our names. In our apartment, the rule sounded like mercy. Until Friday was how my mother turned debt into patience. The blender could disappear Tuesday and reappear Saturday like a well-behaved dog. The winter coats, even in July. Once, as a joke that wasn't funny later, the TV remote. She called it a bridge. Bridges make sense when the river's fast and you promise yourself you won't live on the span, just cross. You don't notice at first that every crossing charges a toll. That summer, the tolls multiplied. Rent grew teeth. Mom's hours shrank to the kind that make time feel personal. Her boyfriend left to give us space, which turned out to be the space on someone else's couch. The mail learned to arrive with color coding, white, then pale pink, then red through a plastic window like an alarm you could hold in your hand. Mom described us as fine and clever and due for some luck. We pressed until Friday against everything like a bandage. The bike arrived the way good things sometimes do. Not brand new, but perfectly timed. Mr. McCarr from the second floor moved into a building with an elevator, and in a ceremony that required a handshake and a solemn, keep it out of the rain, gave me his old silver bike. Under the rust, the frame still believed in itself. I cleaned the chain with a toothbrush, adjusted the seat with a borrowed wrench, and felt something recalibrate in my chest. People say a bike is freedom. For me, it was a map. 15 minutes, and I could rewrite a day. I learned the city in routes, past the lot where the chain-link fence bowed like a belly, up the slow hill by the water tower where the sky got bigger if you looked past the graffiti, around the block with the dog named Thunder who barked like he owned the weather. I learned the timing of lights and the kind of lift you get if you pull just before the curb tries to bite. I learned to arrive home with my head rinsed out and a dust stamp on my ankle because I still didn't own a clip. On a Tuesday in July, the kitchen smelled like heat and laundry. A yellow rectangle lay on the table. Pawn ticket, dandelion-colored, stamped with date and item. Bicycle. The handwriting made it official in the way handwriting sometimes does. Mom stood at the sink with the faucet on like she wanted the sound to be her alibi. She explained with careful words, temporary, Friday, bridge. The word that didn't show up was ask. I put the ticket in my pocket so the paper could feel how fast my heart was going. That night, I turned the ceiling into a scoreboard. I had 3 days. Rescue missions don't start with heroics, they start with arithmetic. I counted what I had, coins, energy, a good face for adults in aprons, what I needed, not much if your mouth says it confidently, and what I could stand losing, sleep, skin off my palms, pride. I made a list in my head. Lists feel like ladders. You climb or you stare. Work is always there if you're cheap enough and small enough to be ignored. I was both. The next morning, I pulled weeds along the front walk because the landlord hadn't paid the teenager who usually did it. Mr. Green in 1B paid me a few crumpled bills and advice about sunscreen. At noon, I fished bottles from park bins with a bread bag looped at my wrist and brought them to the shack near the depot where a man in a green visor made your effort official on a scale that squeaked like it had opinions. In the evening, I wiped the kiosk windows for the mustachioed guy who sold lottery tickets, soda, and sentences about how a boy with hustle can outrun a month. Coins grew heavy in my pocket in that way money does when you've earned it with your hands. I poured them into a jar under my bed, counted out loud like it was a spell, and fell asleep with the number in my mouth so I wouldn't lose it in the night. On Thursday, I needed a last chunk that looked small on paper and large in a 12-year-old day. At the market, I offered to unload watermelons from a truck. The driver raised an eyebrow at my arms. I raised one back at the stack. He shrugged. By the fourth trip, my shoulder felt tender and proud. By the 10th, I understood where bruises come from when they're honest. He peeled off a few bills and called me clockwork, a compliment shaped like metal. I hid the jar deeper that night, behind shoes that didn't fit anyone yet and a holiday tablecloth we never used. In the morning, the space under my bed had a new kind of air, the kind left when something you need isn't where your hand expects it. On the kitchen table, a note. Borrowed a little, back by Friday. No mame, the handwriting I knew. I stared at the note and pictured my rescue window narrowing like an eye. There's a particular quiet you learn when your plan springs a leak. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I put on the t-shirt with the bike grease stain and walked to the shop. The bell did its blunt knuckle thing. The air inside had the metallic cool of people who have air conditioning on purpose. Behind glass, someone's chainsaw, someone's second wedding ring, a camera that still had dust on the lens from a vacation. In the corner, my bike stood upright like it had learned better manners without me. A cardboard tag hung from the handlebar. Numbers I already knew. The clerk looked like people look when they've heard 10,000 explanations. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't soft. He was procedural. I set the ticket and my careful money on the counter. He lined up fees and dates. By the book, I was short. By the book, the fee had grown in the night the way bread rises if you don't watch it. He read my face the way you read weather. He said he could recalculate, which sounded like a mercy you can't request, only accept. He lowered a number by the width of a thumb. I slid over coins with hands that had learned how to lift watermelons without dropping them. My knees went a little loose when he wheeled the bike around and lifted it over the gate. Up close, it looked both exactly the same and older by a week. The chain made that tight, hopeful sound it makes when it wants oil and reassurance. Out on the sidewalk, the bell gave a guilty jingle like it knew it had spent time behind glass. I felt my head unclench. Standing there with the ticket folded inside my pocket, I also felt something else, a suspicion the mission wasn't finished. I didn't ride home. I rode 3 blocks in the other direction, down the alley where the mechanic with 2 good jokes and 1,000 tools rented a garage from the city and called it a shop. He liked me because I asked questions like, "What does this bolt do?" and listened to the answer. I asked if I could keep the bike there for a few days. He shrugged the way adults do when they approve and also want you to think you owe them nothing. He rolled the door, pointed at a corner, and said a sentence just for me. "It's safe here." At home, the kitchen had the air of a room that already knows how the conversation will go. Mom sat with her elbows on the table. No one mentioned the note. No one said bike. She talked about the electric bill's sudden ambition and the way the manager's schedule treated her like a suggestion. I stirred tea and nodded and said the kind of sentences a child says when they understand facts and also understand subtext. That night, sleep had splinters. Friday took its time, like a bus you can see from 2 stops away. The boyfriend texted from the soft prison of a friend's couch, asking if we had a spare for the weekend. I thought of my jar and did not reply. Mom asked if I could run to the shop with her when she got off at 5. She used the voice that braided apology with expectation. I said sure and took the long way to the mechanic where I wiped the chain and breathed like a person not drowning. At 5:37, we stood in front of the glass. The clerk did his bell. Mom unfolded the ticket and her purse in the same motion. Numbers got typed. A small frown assembled itself on the clerk's face. I could feel it before I saw it. He said the total, and it was higher than our math. Mom's lips flattened the way they do when she's doing algebra in her throat. She reached into the purse for the shape of money that wasn't there and landed on the shape of anger instead. She looked at me like this was the moment to be a miracle.
I swallowed once and told the truth. It's already redeemed. The room tilted without moving. The clerk glanced between us the way you look at weather you can't control. Mom said what, flat as a cutting board. I said I'd done it yesterday and kept the bike at the mechanic's so it wouldn't walk back into glass without my permission. I said I can't be collateral, and the words felt too big in my mouth and exactly right in the air. What happened next wasn't a movie. There was no shout, no slap, no orchestral forgiveness. My mother's face did a flicker. Relief first, then insult, then something like grief, because losing a rule is like losing a railing you've leaned on too long. She said I should have told her. I said she should have asked me. We stood there with the clerk, pretending to tidy paperwork that didn't exist, both of us choosing smaller sentences so the room wouldn't break. On the walk home, we invented a new rule, softer than the old one and more expensive in the ways that matter. We wrote it down later and taped it inside the cabinet with the T. No pawning kids' things, not bikes, not school shoes, not instruments that feel like lungs. If a bridge is needed, we find a different one. We sell what's ours, not what makes us us. That should be the end of the story, but summers have aftershocks. A week later, I stopped by the mechanic's and found him with the garage door half up, a stray cat pretending it had an appointment, and a coffee that had been microwaved back to life. He handed me a rag without looking and said, like we were picking up a conversation from the middle, that we could start a Friday jar. The idea was simple. A metal tin by the register where people who had a good week could drop $1, and people who'd had the kind of week pawn shops are built for could take one. No speeches, no forms, a bridge that didn't charge interest. He patted the lid and said, I can't fix the river kid, but I can build a better plank. We kept it quiet. Some weeks the jar had lint and a button. Some weeks it surprised us. I learned to tell the difference between the person who needed help and the one who wanted to perform needing help. Mostly, I learned how good it feels to hand someone exactly enough without making them rehearse their shame. I started watching for yellow tickets in people's hands the way a lifeguard watches for wrists that signal more than splashing.
In August, the bakery's new apprentice burned a tray of rolls so completely they looked like fossils. She put the ruined batch in a bag and knocked on the mechanic's door like she was turning herself in. He laughed and traded her a coffee. I asked her how the job was going, and she said she loved the smell of sugar even when it went wrong. We gave her the Friday jar without explaining it, and she tucked $3 in like she'd been waiting to be useful all day. That's how the jar worked. People wanted to carry each other without paperwork. I thought I'd left the pawn shop behind when I turned 18 and moved across town for community college. I worked nights stacking boxes and mornings taking notes that would eventually turn into a piece of paper about business, which is a fancy word for how do we keep the lights on without selling our bones. I visited Mom on Sundays. The tea cabinet rule stayed taped and sun-stained and stubborn. We did better because we did boundaries. At 21, I still ride. Different bike, different streets, same wind. On weekends, I sometimes circle back through the old block just to check what the bakery smells like and whether the shop's bell still sounds like a knuckle. One Saturday, I caught the crosswind and felt both, sugar and collateral. I almost kept going.
Then I saw a kid through the glass, skinny wrists, nervous shoulders, holding the same yellow rectangle I'd once folded into my pocket like a passport I didn't want. I went in. The bell announced me like a witness. The clerk was new, younger, with the same procedural face that says, "I don't write the rules, I just operate them." The bike the kid was trying to get back was small and red and missing most of its dignity, but not all. The math didn't work. I could see it from 3 feet away. The fee had risen in the night. The boy's coins clung to his palm as if more weight would invent value. There's a kind of help that turns you into a savior in your own mind and someone's story in theirs. I didn't want that. I stepped to the counter and asked the clerk to recalculate, the way one does when one recognizes a mercy and asks it to walk out into the light. He did the little head tilt, the thumb width reduction, the performance of officialdom. The kid still came up short. I slid a few bills forward without making eye contact with either of them. The clerk took them without ceremony. The tag came off the handlebar. The kid stared at the bike like it had decided to remember him.
On the sidewalk, he said thanks in a voice that hadn't quite decided if it wanted to be a kid's voice or a teenager's. I told him to keep it out of the rain, which is how you say, "I see you," without making a speech. He nodded like I'd handed him a secret and rode away in a gear too high for the hill. I didn't follow. You don't follow rescues. You just try to make sure they have a road. Back home, I keep the old ticket in my wallet, not as a grudge, as a map. It's soft at the corners now, the ink bleached a little by time and the heat of a pocket. When I thumb it, I remember the math of 3 days and the taste of bottled water dust and the way a chain sounds when it wants oil more than it wants attention. I remember the note on the table and the quiet it demanded from a kid who would learn to be helpful before he learned to be asked. I also remember the cabinet door with the new rule taped inside. No pawning kids' things. The paper is tea-stained, the tape is tired, the rule still holds. People think the rescue was about a bike. It wasn't. It was about learning which objects are things and which are anchors. It was about the first time I said, even if only to myself at a counter that smelled like metal, "I'm not for pawn." It was about discovering that bridges are better when the people building them don't charge you for crossing. If you ever find yourself between a bakery and a pawn shop, take a breath. If it smells like sugar and collateral, you're in a place like mine. Maybe you're carrying a yellow ticket. Maybe you're carrying a story with fees attached. Either way, here's what I know at 21. 3 days is enough time to become the person who shows up with exact change for the object, for the kid, for yourself. And when the bell over the door sounds like a knuckle, answer it. Some rescues don't need sirens. They just need someone to walk in with their shoulders down, their eyes steady, and their hand already reaching for the jar.